Hey VC, Christian here again. I'm just going to do another video. Yesterday I had the great privilege of playing in a community football match here in Melbourne. It's known as the Tim Hemmensley Cup, which is Tim Hemmensley was a Melbourne musician back in the 80s and throughout, and he passed away not long ago. And it's it's a football match. One team versus one team of Melbourne musos called the Rock Dogs. We play against various uh, music venue staff and music industry people from around the place. They usually form the opposing team. Yesterday it was a cracker of a day, and anyway, it just got me thinking about sort of the wealth of music that we have here in Melbourne, and how it is really a music city of the world, I think. Um, you know, in Australia is a really large continent, as you guys know, and for bands to sort of make a name for themselves in Australia, I think they have to come to Melbourne and do it first. Um, maybe not so much these days with the internet and a lot of online stuff. But Melbourne really is where it happens in Australia as far as music goes, and I'm so privileged to live here and have been part of the music scene in my era as well. Um, and to be part of this football match yesterday was just a really cool privilege. It inspired me to do a this video today. The video I'm going to do is a sort of a brief and very non-complete timeline of Melbourne music. Melbourne has a big tradition of jazz music, so I'm not going to cover that. I think I'll leave that. I'm going to do a sort of a rock, the history of rock in Melbourne, or a bit of a timeline of rock anyway. It's only based on the records that I own. I don't own every Melbourne record, obviously, so I can't show everything there is, and there is definitely going to be holes in my timeline. But I thought just for a bit of fun, I'd show you some music from my hometown and stuff that I think is worth mentioning and worth showing for you guys who might not have been to Melbourne before and experienced its live music scene. Here goes nothing. Hope you enjoy the video. Cheers. Like most of the globe, I assume, in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there was a big sort of predominance of progressive rock, blues rock sort of stuff coming out of just about everywhere, and Melbourne was no exception. Um, the difference was, I guess, for this time, was Melbourne really didn't have its pub scene, its pub rock scene until much later. So bands like this, would usually be found at festivals and larger scale rock concerts. Things like Sunbury come to mind when we think of Melbourne musicians and how they got out there to the public. It was usually through these large scale performances. Bands like Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, and things like there was Matt Taylor and a handful of other guys sort of pioneered this real blues rock sort of era of Aussie music. But in amongst that was this fantastic band called Spectrum, who released this wonderful and ambitious double record called Miles Ago in 1972, I think it was. Now this one's an Aussie classic, but a classic amongst true music fans. I mean, I don't know how well it did, sort of in the mainstream. It was a double album, had a couple of singles on it, but really wasn't it's probably not going to be remembered in the same way as sort of AC/DC or anything like that. It's pressed on the Harvest label, Australian Harvest. Australia had its own sort of version of Harvest Records, or an affiliation of some kind of Harvest Records. A beautiful record, this one. Mike Rudd was the singer-songwriter and lead guitarist of this band. Very famous guy around these parts. His son, I think it's his son, went on and has a career of his own at the moment, Xavier Rudd. But yeah, this band, this is definitely classic Melbourne blues rock, progressive rock stuff that's well worth a mention. In amongst those kind of bands, there's there's lots of other bands that around the country, but in Melbourne in particular, another band that comes to mind is Madder Lake. They released two really great records, progressive rock, progressive style. There's blues elements in there, but really this is much more hard edge than the other stuff we were talking about. Madder Lake, beautiful artwork as well. This was their debut, Still Point, from 1973, and then this one here, Butterfly Farm, which I think came out a year or two later. Oh no, same year apparently. Same year it was released on the Mushroom Records label, which is pretty cool. Madder Lake, another great progressive rock band from Melbourne. Also, I think worth mentioning is this band here. I mean, as far as sort of jazz rock, fusiony type stuff goes, we didn't have a lot of. There wasn't, a huge tradition of that here in Australia. But this band here, Mackenzie Theory, is a record that I highly recommend to anyone who's a fan of sort of John McLaughlin-esque fusion, guitar-based fusion. This album has always reminded me a little bit of something like, the Grateful Dead's Dark Star on the Live Dead record. A magical sort of guitar fusion journey, Again, this is on the Mushroom label. From 1975, I think this record is. Yeah, a wonderful record, this one. Yeah, highly recommend this. And at the same time, all this is happening, in so much as to say this is happening around the world too. Australia, isn't that isolated from what was happening, but late 70s, mid to late 70s, we also had our electronic band, our progressive electronic act, Cybertron. This is their debut record from I think it's 1977, maybe. Not sure. This is on the Clear Light of Jupiter label. But I'm sure you guys know this band already. It's pretty well known amongst record collectors. I show this because it's fantastic music and because I think in retrospect it's a very significant record. But really, I'm not sure how much of an impact this music had on Melburnians back when it was released. I would say very little, actually. But it's a wonderful, wonderful record I wanted to show. I guess we can all agree that in many ways the punk rock movement of late 70s in England and really worldwide was a great leveler of music style and talent and industry stuff as well. It really sort of made the playing field back to sort of rock bottom or ground zero, if you could. Well, that's how I sort of see it anyway. It sort of opened up the doors for all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And Australia, we celebrated the birth of punk rock here in quite a unique way. We had the breakdown of sort of these elite big festival things, and we started to really recognise the pub scene as a great forum for musicians to come and test their wares and play to smallish audiences and grow their fan bases from the grassroots level. Um, there's probably quite a number of great pubs at the time that are really sort of significant, but one that comes to mind is a place called the Crystal Ballroom, which was opened up in the late 70s and run as a sort of little bands. They called it the little bands scene. The bands that used to play at the Crystal Ballroom in St Kilda. Um, and one of those bands that sort of is really worth a mention from that period that I think sort of brought Australian music or Australian post-punk music to the global attention was this band here, the Boys Next Door, led by the very famous Nick Cave, also Mick Harvey, Tracy Pugh, Philip Calvert and Roland S. Howard. This is their debut record on, I think it's Festival. Oh no, it's Mushroom as well. Yeah, this record is a very significant one. And it's not because the music is so groundbreaking, although it's pretty great. Um, I think personally, I think all of these artists get much better later on. Um, but it's all of these key figures that played on this record and really started something new. The scene was really starting to thrive at this time. They only made this one record and then sort of parted ways with a few people and sort of re-imaged themselves into what we now know as the Birthday Party. And the Birthday Party is a really gritty, heavy punk, post-punk sort of gothic act that really took rock music and this sort of avant-garde experimental punk rock, or I don't know what you would call it, but to a new level. It was really quite dark and gothic music, and unlike anything that Melbourne had ever seen before, and I think probably Australia actually had seen before. They actually, they weren't picked up straight away here in Melbourne. One of their most famous records. They were picked up in Britain, and that's where they really sort of picked up and came into worldwide renown. But they definitely started at the Crystal Ballroom in St Kilda. That was their roots. This is on Missing Link Records. I remember as a kid going into Missing Link record store on Flinders Street. It's not there anymore. They don't have a physical store, I don't think, anywhere. But Missing Link was one of these really big sort of cornerstone for music fans in Melbourne. Well, started off pretty early actually, but yeah, definitely in my youth. Around the same time was in that same scene actually, believe it or not, was a band that went on to become quite a well-known rock band here in Australia, but they definitely didn't start out how they ended up anyway. The first record from the Hunters and Collectors was in my opinion, is a post-punk classic. It's a double record here of some really fantastic post-punk sort of gothic rock. Wonderful stuff here on this record. The first single that they released, Talking to a Stranger, I think it's called, is just a fantastic track. Yeah, Talking to a Stranger. This came out on White Label Records. can see that there. Yeah, highly recommend this record as well. I mean, Melbourne was flooded with bands like this at the time. There's nothing, you know, I'm not saying this because these guys were the best bands, but unfortunately with the punk movement and the post-punk movement that happened in Australia, probably worldwide actually, most of the bands couldn't afford to press albums, and the very DIY nature of post-punk meant that there was a hell of a lot of 7-inch singles being pressed and sold at gigs and stuff to small numbers. I'll do another video on that stuff later. I'm absolutely fascinated with this era of Melbourne's music, and I have a bunch of Aussie post-punk singles that I'd like to show you guys, just because I'm very happy to have these, and I like to talk about them. It's one of my favourite sort of genres. But yeah, Hunters and Collectors went on and became quite a commercially recognised band here in Australia, with songs like, you know, The Holy Grail and you know, Throw Your Arms Around Me and things like that. They became quite anthemic songs that they play at the football and things like this. Nothing like where they started, anyway. So yeah, that's a little bit about the sort of the Crystal Ballroom era, Melbourne post-punk sort of. I'm talking about, you know, 79 to sort of 83 period. Fantastic era for music. There was really so many influential Aussie artists that were happening at this time, but because I'm just sort of focusing on Melbourne, I'll sort of leave them for another video. Maybe I'll do one on Sydney and one on Brisbane or Perth or something. But you've got bands like the Triffids and the Church and you know, these fantastic Aussie artists that really did well in Melbourne, and overseas as well. But I'm strictly talking about Melbourne artists here, so maybe I'll leave that for another time. So I'll move on into sort of the mid '80s period, where we've got the introduction of sort of some dream pop elements, synthesizer music, and new wave stuff. But the undercurrent of what was already there, the tradition of punk rock and garage rock, that has always sort of been a really big part of Melbourne's music. While Sydney was sort of big into the sort of jangle pop and very commercial music. Back in this time, bands like In Excess, I think, came from there, and The Church came from Sydney, with Red Eye Records was there as well. We sort of celebrated down here a bit more of a darker, more gothic sound, which will become more evident as the '80s sort of move on into a period of sort of less, I suppose, commerciality in the music. One band that comes to mind that I want to just talk briefly about is the Moodists, who I think are a really important sort of band for Melbourne in sort of the mid to, well, sort of the beginning of the '80s, but really I think this record came out '84. This is Thirsty's Calling, and it's a really awesome record, but a really sort of heavy and dark record. This is on Virgin Records. Heavy, dark, gothic sound. Scary as all shit, really. I mean, this is just ferocious sort of gothic rock. Now, you've got some pretty well-known names here on this album. Dave Graney, who we all know went on. I mean, he's from the UK, but he came here and formed this band in Melbourne. Dave Graney, Steve Miller, Mick Turner, who I'll talk about later on. Mick Turner, I think, is one of the greatest Melbourne guitarists ever to exist. I think he's just so creative and so wonderful. I'll talk about him a little bit more later on. But this is a fantastic album, The Moodists, Thirsty's Calling. For lovers of dark, avant-garde, post-punk, sort of gothic rock, this one's really great. I was talking a little bit about sort of the, this dream pop element, and I'll just talk quickly about this guy, David Bridie, who is well known around these parts for his prolific songwriting. Um, but in the mid '80s, he had a thing called Not Drowning Waving, and he released like a whole heap of records throughout the '80s. This one is one of my favorites. This is on Rampant Records, The Little Desert. It's a wonderful album. Beautiful, sort of Dead Can Dance meets Cocteau Twins meets, I don't know. It's sort of, yeah. It's like a 4AD release almost. It's very sparse, very minimal, but really sort of great songwriting, beautiful lyrics. Yeah, Dave Bridie was a bit of a magician on the old keyboard as well, and made some great stuff happen on these records. I've got a handful of his albums, which I think are worth checking out. This one's the first one, Another Pond, which came out in 80. I'm not sure. I'll look it up and write it there. But yeah, another beautiful record from the mid '80s period in Melbourne. I talked about Mick Turner before, who was a great guitarist, and this record here sort of is a seriously. It's probably not as well known, but it's become more well known because of the celebration of Mick Turner's work later on. But post punk, sort of, well, it's more punk music. Venom P. Stinger, Meet My Friend Venom. This is a fantastic album. It's a reissue. I could never find an OG of this. I think there wouldn't be many left in good condition, I imagine, because they wouldn't have pressed very many, I imagine. It was a private pressing that they sold at gigs and stuff like this. But this has been reissued, I think, last year or the year before on Drag City. It comes with a little thing a little drawn sort of thing with the lyrics and stuff. But this is really fantastic. This is really fantastic punk rock, Melbourne style. With that gothic element, with that really gritty garage element that I think is unique to Melbourne.